Hi, everyone, and welcome to the podcast. I'm here today with Amaya Rourke, who is an animist, folk witch, diviner, and spirit worker. And her work guides others called to a wild witchcraft that straddles the seen and the unseen worlds, really traveling the moonlit and star studded crooked path of the bramble hedge. And rooted in historic folk ways, but it's also updated for contemporary life. And Amaya's practice really seeks to return to these interwoven cycles of the moon, the fixed stars, and the living earth. She has been featured on many podcasts, including the Fabulous Folklore podcast, What Magic Is This podcast, the Saturn Vox podcast, and the Nectar of the Heart. Amaya has been a guest writer for limited edition grimoires such as the Many Moons 2022 Planner and a seasoned workshop facilitator. She wrote and taught a 13-plus week class on traditional astrology for modern witches at the Blackthorn School. And she's also presented at the Fresh Voices in Astrology Summit and guest lectured in Rowan and Sage's Herbaria program. You can find her on Instagram at Amaya Rourke and also on her website at amayarourke.com. And any links to find out more about her work, you can find in the show notes below. And we highly encourage you to check those out after you listen to the episode. Amaya, I'm so glad that you're here. Is there anything else that you would love to bring forward as we kick off the episode to introduce yourself to our listeners?
Absolutely not. Writing that bio was like pulling teeth. And I
Yeah.
think saying anything more feels superfluous.
No,
So,
it's great. I think it's perfect. So we wanted to get together today. You know, the season of the podcast that we're in, we're really focusing on water and the third house, and a lot of your responses to that were so beautiful. So we're going to cover a lot of things about like ancient cosmology and night sky oceans. I know a lot of your work also intersects the moon and the fixed stars, and we're also very ecology forward on this podcast. So it feels like a really beautiful blend of things that we're going to get into. Um, One of the things that I feel like I'd love to just dive deep and wide sort of at the beginning of the episode is really contextualizing, you know, the ancient Babylonians, Egyptians, Greeks, Romans really believed the night sky or conceived of the night sky as this cosmic ocean from which all life was birthed. And how do you want to like steer us into that, into the ship of this conversation, into that cosmic ocean? Do you mind speaking a little bit to that worldview, some of what it included, and perhaps also how you're carrying that forward into your work in contemporary life today?
yeah, I think it's important to remember that these cultures were right next to the sea. And so for them, the ocean was both the giver of life and the taker of life, which then gets reflected in later Hellenistic astrology, which is what is our modern astrology is based on, where the Greeks were talking about the moon and how the moon was both it was called the mediatrix that both gives and kind of takes life, and the moon correlating to the ocean, right? But before that, the sky itself was this big, broad ocean. So you see this in the mythology of the Babylonians, where first there was this chaotic void, which is an ocean, and you have Tiamat, who has domain over this void. And through the various different exploits of different heroes and other gods, she is put under control in a sense, or kind of like pushed away. I'm simplifying this greatly, so it's easier for people to understand without us just going into Babylonians for 3 hours straight. um, where she's not as capable of causing as much like chaos or creation as she used to be. Like they're like, we like this earth, we're good, right? Um, and this then gets reflected by the Egyptians, because the Egyptians believed the night sky was again an ocean, but also a god itself, which is the goddess Nut. Nut is the night sky through which the gods would then take the barge of Canopus, which is the underworld barge, traveling through the night sky, which they consider to be the underworld in a sense, to then be reborn again, particularly the sun god. And so you see this get reflected over and over again and just kind of changed by culture. And culture is always informed by place. And so all of these myths kind of shift. So you don't see as much about like Tiamat was a dragon or a large serpent, because dragons were not, they didn't have wings yet. That was more of a Northern European kind of thing where eventually they get wings. But the dragons of ancient cultures, particularly in this area of the world, the Mediterranean and the kind of surrounding areas, they were like giant serpents. And so you have Tiamat, who's, the goddess of chaos, but also the mother of all of creation. And then the Egyptians are like, you have Nut, the night sky goddess. And there are gods and goddesses that take on these snaky roles, but not as directly related to the water. And then you get to the Greeks, and the Greeks have these dragons that are always associated with waterways, right? And the North and the South Node, which are the nodes of the moon, they are also associated with dragons, which again to them were not these winged creatures we think of today, but instead these giant serpents that travailed through the waters, right? They also, all these cultures believe that the West would lead you to the underworld. Now, the underworld isn't what we think of as like hell. I think a lot of us, we just immediately associate this with like, that's where you go after you die. Maybe a little bit more neutral than the Christian idea of hell, but oftentimes still correlated somehow with it. The underworld was just basically the equivalent of the Celtic otherworld. It's another world that you go to after you pass away. And there's good places in it and there's bad places in it. And it kind of parallels our middle world or the upper world, so to speak, right? And so they believed if you traveled west far enough, and this is reflected in the mythology of the Greeks, that eventually you would hit the underworld or the kind of gateways to the underworld. And this is where you see the myths of like Medusa when she is sentenced to leave, depending on which myth. I'm a Medusa kind of aficionado, but we'll go with the one most people understand, where she is the temple maiden of Athena and she is violated by Neptune. And so she is turned into the monster. She gets sent to the west. And she is sitting at the edge of what we call the Stygian realm. And this is actually a place of the ocean. Now, what most people don't realize is that she's actually just returning home because she was a creature of the ocean. And so she was always meant to be a protectress, that's the meaning of her name, of this liminal realm before you enter the Stygian realm, which you then have to cross to get to the underworld where Hades is. And you see lots of this throughout the myths. When you go beyond just Medusa and you get to the other myth of Perseus, which is to go with the Argonauts, right? Um, the Argonauts are going to the edge of the world to attain the Golden Fleece. So again, we're going to the west to get to a place that's somewhere between the underworld and this world, right? And it's this idea of like this cosmic void where everything is born and everything returns. And it's not quite the underworld and it's not quite the middle world, it's something else. And it's where everything seems to have come from. And the Romans reflect this because the Romans basically just grew out of Greek culture into their own much more militaristic culture. And so this just keeps getting reflected over and over. And I wish I could say this is just kind of restricted to this area of the world, but you see this reflected kind of everywhere. Again, you get up into like, I live in Ireland, you get to the Celtic countries up here, and they also believed that the other world would be found to the west. And there is this big ocean that you have to cross to get there, and that the sky is often given correlations to bodies of water. For example, here they believe that the Milky Way was reflected by Boan and the River Shannon, right? And so it keeps getting reflected as the sky is ocean and the ocean is sky, and they saw them as kind of congruent as one another. And probably because we to this day know more about the moon than we do about our own ocean. And I think that's a pretty wild thing. And all these cultures depend on the ocean to live. And so they saw it as both life giving and life taking because that's what their experience of it was. You go into the ocean and yeah, you could catch a bunch of fish and you're good to go. Or you could crash your ship and die. And there was very little recourse to that back then. So you see this reflecting, and I always say this about myth. Myth is always a reflection of the culture that it's in. That's why there is no such thing as like universal myth. Those little details make a huge difference, and that's why I get kind of like persnickety about that. We can
Mm-hmm.
see reflections of similar cosmology, but like what the Celtic people believed is going to be very different than say the Babylonians, right? Very different kind of culture in the way that they looked at, interacted with, had a relationship with, and respected the very depths of the unknown ocean itself. And they saw the glittering sky getting reflected on it, and all of them said, oh, well, then obviously that's where we all came from. That right there.
Yeah, I'm thinking a lot too about how in a lot of myth, it's like the ocean is sort of the landscape of heroic conquest or voyage. and the stars as the way that one navigates in the sea as well. It's like where are we going? And then we look up and see sort of that mirror for where we are in time space. Um, and I really like the relation to placeness, and thank you for bringing that in, like especially in regards to myth, because I feel like in a world where we are just going like where we feel like I think culturally globalization is always better or universalizing things, like there's something that gets lost when we miss out on locality and like belonging to place and just really appreciating those specificities, and also allowing ourselves to be quote like boxed in by those limitations can really be a gift, I feel like, as well as a sort of an unlocking to our own connection with magic um, and
Yeah,
myth. So
I totally agree. And you know, it's funny, we actually navigated by the stars worldwide up until like the mid 18th century. And so we didn't have navigation tools. We just were using the sky, you know, and you had to know about how everything rotated and moved throughout the year. Because if you're looking at the summer triangle in the summer, that's great. But if you look at it later, you're going to be lost.
mm-hmm.
And you really had to have a good handle on that. And so all these cultures that were sending out, you know, voyages that were both adventurous but also often had their, you know, all their mercantilism to other countries and trades, and you'd bring back food, right? You got to know where you're going. And so it gets intertwined. And actually, the number one coolest thing if you're into sailing is that as you learn sailing, if you're an astrologer, you start to realize, wow, everything in astrology is related to sailing. All the words we have related to sailing, everything having to do with navigation, sailing, like it's pretty wild. So like we talk about the ascendant, it's a steersman at the helm. That's what they
Mm-hmm.
called it in Hellenistic Greek if we were going to actually translate it accurately. And it keeps going like that. Everything that you look at is just like, oh, there's another reference to the ocean. And no wonder they thought that everything came from a cosmic void because it was so important to them as a civilization, right?
Yeah, I feel like also as an element, water comes through pretty strongly for me as far as like how we live and how we relate to that which is within our control and without our control, and all the qualities of water, you know, I feel like are very medicinal, in my opinion, to how our current culture um, names success or how we're supposed to live. Like we live in a culture that's very like always forging, always like it's more fiery and more airy, in my opinion, as far as we're elementally. And water is asking us to like really notice the limits to what we know, the limits to what we're capable of. Like you can be the best sailor in the world, but you can't control the ocean, right? We can do our best to like navigate the weather and the storms, but there's a level of like surrender and grandness and peace that we have to make with the void that I feel like is a skill that we have that we're not as great at, I feel like, as a whole in contemporary culture. In general, what are some of the things that you feel like with water, and maybe also relating to the moon as ways of the ways that they start to speak elementally and also maybe like magically to our roles as humans or to how we're sort of like moving through life, but whether mythically or mundanely or both?
Wow, big question. One thing that I was thinking of while you were relaying all this about water is I had to make a shift in my witchcraft practice a few years ago towards something more oceanic.
Mm.
I'd started there and I'd gotten way far away from it, and I had to come back and like deepen into that. And one of the things you learn very quickly when you're trying to learn about something elementally, I personally go directly for like what is physically happening first, and
Mm-hmm.
then how does that correlate to the spiritual? And um, the reason why the weatherman isn't accurate is because water is not linear and it's very fluid. And so, what happens with air pressure and changes in the atmosphere? I mean, it's really wild. We just think about our own area. It can be affected, however, by something thousands of miles away. And I think Ireland's such a great place to like learn this because it's actually on the tail end of the Gulf Stream coming back up. Um, and so when we have storms come, it's usually hit the east coast of the United States and traveled up to us. So we just had Storm Agnes hit us. And it was down in some islands previously, like tropical areas. And people don't understand that, right? And so we had this weather that was about to turn winter. and it was getting crisp and cold, my favorite kind of weather here, where we've got like mist and fog in the morning. I'm so excited. And then it just rapidly warmed back up. And we just had this weather prediction that it was going to be a very warm week. And suddenly it's gone back to cold because the storm front's gone, right? And
Mm.
so you start to learn very quickly, like, I feel like in an age where there's a lot of air, which air, especially I'm an Aquarius sun, so like I think about fixed air a lot and how it really wants to like pin things down and everything's going to be organized. Like, it's a very Saturnian kind of air thing. Or like Libra is looking for balance and ratio, right? And it can adjust in the moment, but there's specific ideas it has that are, that's the reason why it's an exaltation of Saturn. It's a little more fixed, right? And then you get to Gemini, which is honestly the crazy alchemist. I love Gemini people. Likes to flip things upside down just to see what will happen, right? But most of the time, they've got these ideas. All of them have sacred cows. And that's not going to work when you're studying weather. If you get a fixed idea of how things are going to work, you're going to be disappointed almost always. I think my favorite fact to share with people is when it shows you you have a 90% chance of rain. Do you know what that actually means? Most people don't. It has nothing to do with the actual precipitation. It has to do with the land area that they're covering for the weather report. It means that you have a high chance in 90% of this area you may get rain. So you could be the 10% that does not.
Mm.
And you could be like, it said it was going to rain all day. And I stayed inside. It's like, no, that's not how you read it. It's not giving you a chance of like precipitation. It's giving you a chance of this area is going to get rain. Only 90% of it though. So if I say, for example, where I live, Sligo, 90% of Sligo is going to get rain is what they mean. Not you have a 90% chance of rain. And that kind of blows people's minds. And that's because it's so interchangeable. And there's micro, what you've got in the big cycle, it gets micro, right? And if you start studying water or sailing, I was a sailor for a while, it's just like that too. You'll think like, oh, it's going to be easy sailing, but the water in the ocean is affected by the water in the air and vice versa. And like most people don't know this, the ocean changes in salinity based off of heat. And so if it gets too hot, it gets way more salty and dense and it slows things down. And if it gets really, really cold, the salinity gets much less and suddenly everything speeds up. And so you can, especially in storm fronts, you can imagine if things get really hot, salinity just got dense. And yeah, if you get hit by a wave, it's going to feel like you got walloped, right? But the minute it cools down, it's going to travel faster, but it's going to be lighter. Everything changes based off of these moisture levels. And so it's very fluid. And when we think about fluidity, we're just thinking about water trickling down a rock or something. But actually, you can think about it being completely nonlinear. It's not going to go in just one direction, it can disperse in many. And it's the reason why people like Da Vinci, he made a study of water to understand how things rippled and like the physics of it. And it takes up a great majority of his notebook. He keeps studying it over and over again because it's kind of baffling him. It's not the same as, say, a piece of earth that you put on like a vibrating plate. It's not going to fall the same way every single time. Water has different densities, different components in it. So when we think about that in the moon, we can actually see that physically in our bodies. So we were talking before, I'm a Cancer moon. You can kind of see that I have a rounder face, right? If you could see below, I'm an endowed woman. Like that's a very typical thing with Cancer moons. You're a Taurus moon, and you've got kind of that Earth Mama look to you, right? But when we get into the fine details of like who's your dispositor, that will also change things, right? And that's the thing about the moon. It is the mediatrix. It's taking all these effects, which gives you thousands, millions of possible combinations, and it's bringing it down and putting it into material existence. And it is ultimately the mediator in time, which is not linear. It's fluid. I love Doctor Who and how they talk about like, oh, it's not all happening like in one straight line. It's wibbly wobbly, timely wimey stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's how the moon is dealing with time, which is why people often get kind of, I feel, disoriented trying to get a hold of their astrology because they don't realize that the moon ultimately is the trigger point for a lot of this.
Mm-hmm.
And the condition of the moon and what else is going on, which there's so much more to the moon than just the sign it's in. You have the
Mm-hmm.
distance it has from the earth, how close it is to the nodes, what phase it's in, and the fact that it affects tides and things like that. We don't even know how it affects the human body. We can't measure it properly yet. Imagine you could have a really great moon, but it's affecting your partner in a really bad way. So you're supposed to have this really romantic weekend, and the moon is mediating that. And partner's not doing so well with those effects. And you don't get what you expected because it doesn't work in this like linear, straightforward way. It's happening all at once in kind of like a giant balled up knot that we have a very hard time unwinding. And it's just like watching water or air streams. It's just not direct, which I think is a little bit overwhelming or even scary for people to kind of conceive of.
I think that's true. And I think it's especially true when we're like coming to magical practices with the theory that it's about ultimate control of our lives. Um, my experience has been quite the opposite. And I think also, it's returning me to this image of the snake and the serpent, that it isn't a fixed thing, it's indirect, and it's also alive. It's this writhing, swirly serpent, and it has a breath and its own sort of trajectory and like way of moving. So we're not really like grappling with like, if I can just understand it enough or go in a straight line, then like I will have solved the puzzle. Like it's an alive thing that we have to just learn how to writhe with, I think, and dance with. And I love the Doctor Who. We just have to kind of reach into this. It's really about how we learn to reach into the sphere and then back out again. And like, as opposed to just like you were talking about, like fixing things or pinpointing things, or intellectually understanding things. It's quite the opposite, I think.
I think for those who have a witchcraft or magic practice, you quickly learn when you have made spirit relationships that first of all, you have to depend on more than just yourself. So it actually is about there's a thing about your will. You need to get
Mm-hmm.
very clear about what you desire, but there's also this component of giving up trust to something that is outside of your control.
Mm-hmm.
And you quickly learn that your job is to try to sink into the flow and not try to pull the flow in any one direction. If you sink into it, you're going to have much better results, anyways.
Mm-hmm.
And I use astrology, as someone who considers themselves more witch than astrologer, more to like figure out where I am in the flow and be like, okay, I can drop in here. This is the place I drop in and I do my thing. And it will have a better outcome because I'm going with it rather than I'm going to try to supersede this. That's like you trying to stand in front of a dam as they lift the wall and being like, I'm going to make it go in another direction by myself.
Yeah.
It's not going to happen. And I think that's what makes life magical.
Mm-hmm.
You have to think about there's a relationship to time, and time is a multi headed being like a hydra. And knowing that, it's kind of how I put it to people is you do have free will, but your choice is kind of like a ripple that affects a lot of things, and someone else's choice is doing the same thing. So you're in cosmic soup, constantly rippling back and forth and affecting each other and not even realizing it. So what seems super certain when we're looking at like, some sort of predictive astrology may change because of someone else that you've never even met
Mm-hmm.
making a decision and say pissing off your boss that day.
Mm-hmm.
And that promotion you thought for sure was going to happen suddenly gone.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not something that you can control, right? And that's not to say that there's no use to looking at these things. What we're seeing is possibilities and opportunities, but it doesn't guarantee results. And I think that that's the longer I'm in astrology, the more I'm like, I don't have control. I can make my choices and I can make the best choices available to me in that moment. And astrology can give me a really good window to understand what those choices are. But that doesn't guarantee specific results.
Yeah, it's more like it helps us learn to ride the snake better. I think it's like, if it is this like great creature, this great force that it's not that we like conquer it, is that we just like get better at riding it. I think, as opposed to just like swimming around and like watching it go by. It's like, how do we like ride with it or dance on its back or whatever? Yeah, how do we choose the opportunities or the pockets of time space where we can really get a better glimpse, or exert our will more fruitfully. But I think the thing that you're really touching on that I think is really important is that aspect of like, and there's always an element of surrender, like that has to be there. And I think that's something that's missing from a lot, or at least some of the conversations that I see or some of the viewpoints that I see, that it's not just about like pulling in and wielding control and gripping fast, and if you do it perfectly it's going to be able to control the outcome. Like the very like the end, you do your best, and then like that surrender at the end, like that has to be the ultimate goal, because that's actually where I think our greatest power is. um which is again kind of coming back to it's like the sailing or water. Like, it's best to be on a boat if you're going for a long voyage. It's best to repair it and know where you're going and how to read the stars. And ultimately there is also an element of surrender where like you don't know when you'll end up or what will happen. And yeah.
The goal is to be able to read the signs.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're on a boat, there's no guarantee that you're going to get a certain kind of sailing, right? That the winds are going to do this or the water is going to do that. But what you're doing ultimately is you're responding in real time in relationship with the water and the wind. And you have to learn how to read those signs and speak fluidly that language. And that's ultimately what I feel we're trying to do with astrology is I'm trying to get the quality of time so I can
Mm-hmm.
choose how I'm steering my ship.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes you batten down the hatches and you go underneath and you just pray. Um, I think that something this brings up for me is the concept of the muse in Greek philosophy. It was a nice out for both people who were successful and were not, because ultimately what it came down to is they believed that no matter if you were successful or not, it was not fully your own responsibility, but it was also the responsibility of the muse to show up and do their job. Um, and so if they don't show up, but you've done your part, you don't have to sit there and think that you're an abject failure because things didn't turn out the way you wanted. And also, if you are successful, you can't take full credit either and become full of yourself. Because either way, there's this hidden element, this other person that is unseen, this spirit that's either coming in and blessing the project and showing up to make it something bigger and better, or it's not. And if it is, then you owe a lot of gratitude to that being. And if it's not, you can let go of some of these
Mm-hmm.
um, self punishment that we especially today give ourselves when we do not succeed at something, which I think is a hard pill to swallow because we're living in an age of hyper individualism. And I would say that the moon kind of disproves that, because the earth does not exist in a bubble by itself. It's highly dependent on the sun, the moon, and the stars. And if we did not have the pull of the moon, we would have never had the tides. We would have never had the locomotion to have life on earth. And without the sun, we wouldn't have had the heat. And together they create their own, dynamic of magnetism that causes air tides and atmosphere tides, which is crazy to research what happens during like eclipses, which we have an eclipse season coming up here,
Mm-hmm.
and how it actually physically does affect the plasma in the atmosphere. Particularly when there's an eclipse of the moon, it's far worse than when there's an eclipse of the sun. Um, and then we get into things like earth tides. There are earth tides. Most people don't know that, but the earth actually pulls in certain directions depending on where the moon is, too. And like this is actually the locomotion that created the ability for any life to even exist on earth. So when people are like, if you got rid of the moon, everything would be better.
Oh.
No. Bad idea. Without the moon, the earth wouldn't exist. We were really lucky to have this satellite that was the exact distance it was from the earth. And it shows that like nothing succeeds in a bubble by itself. Everything is interdependent here. And we have to kind of come to that conclusion for ourselves too. Like my success, some of it is on me. Did I do my part? But if I did my part and it still wasn't the way that I thought it was going to be, that's not just on me. That's on many forces outside of me. And I just showed up and did my part, and that's all I can really expect myself to do. And it gives you a fluidity to then be able to pick yourself up and keep going on to other things. I think right now we are, because we're in an age of hyper documentation, we
Mm.
document every part of our lives. It means that everything feels way more important than it actually is.
Yeah.
And failure is so much more acute because there is a social component to it that otherwise didn't exist even 30 years ago. Um, if you didn't have a business that succeeded, only you and your family really knew. It wasn't like an entire group of people on the internet were like watching you flounder, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or if you didn't win that contest or whatever, it was within this little tiny sphere. And so you had this ability to kind of come back from it. because it didn't feel as well, we have an evolutionary need for social acceptance, so it didn't feel as threatening to us. Now we are,
Hmm.
constantly being monitored by not only ourselves in a way that's probably way beyond healthy, but then by other people too, as an audience. And when we don't succeed, it feels that much more dangerous. And the moon says that's part of life.
Yeah.
How many things have I seeded that don't actually come to fruition?
Hmm. Yeah, and it comes back to sort of where you started, where it's like the place of the birth of all life, the formless void, and where all life returns. And that's just part of how it works. And we're much more okay and excited about the beginnings of things and the endings of things. And thinking about how we're just sort of sandwiched between the two oceans and how like we have that movement above and below, which for me is a really helpful image. And I think that, even especially in like sort of common astro syntax, like we're very solar focused. Like, what's your sign? Like we're always talking about that is like almost exclusively referring to where someone's sun is, and it's lacking a lot of like nuance and context and full appreciation of the full complexity of the fingerprint of the chart. And also the weather of ongoing. Like, I think, the practice of knowing where we are in stellar time and space is like ongoing, which I think gets missed out a lot. But I love, the framing or the bringing to mind the moon as this sort of mediatrix, this sort of translator of the heavens to the earth in a lot of ways, like the way that we sort of filter to and through and from those layers of the heavens and also the waters below us. And I'm wondering if you'd speak a little bit more to the role of the moon as sort of that mediator for us, and also what are some ways that people could potentially like maybe strengthen or hone in on that relationship a little bit more.
Yeah. So the moon was known as the mediatrix because we can kind of think about this as a sandwich, right? The moon has to do with kind of like immediate cycles, and then Saturn has to do with super long term cycles, 2.5 year cycles, right? So you can kind of think about like seeds for big things comes from Saturn, and the moon plants them. And over many different cycles, they grow. And those smaller cycles, which we kind of think of like a spiral, is moon cycles, right? Couched within a bigger cycle of Saturn over 2.5 years. So, what the moon does is when it makes contact with a planet or a fixed star or a part of your chart, it activates that and it brings to fruition whatever's going on there. Now, this is going to be dependent on, is this growth or is this decay? Is what is the state of the moon? Because you could say that the state of the moon is ultimately the arbitrator of like things beginning or ending, right? So if the moon is waxing, growing in light, then things are beginning and they're growing. And different phases are going to give you a little bit like sometimes it's spicy, that's going to be like your quarter moons, right? Sometimes it feels like it's never going to end and it's so long and you're at that gibbous moon. It's just right before the full moon. You're like, can we just move on from this? I have a gibbous moon in my chart. It never feels prepared. And yet also it's like, I'm tired of this. And when you get to the full moon, that's usually when you get this full illumination, whatever you've been kind of running up that hill for. Finally, you're at the top. And then you've got the waxing. And the waxing is when things are coming down from that. Usually, the first few phases, like on a personal level, you're usually going to be integrating like lessons. You might be actually spreading those and sharing those with other people. But towards the end, it really is just you kind of wanting to go into your shell, hermit out, because there's kind of a death process going on there. Something that used to be is no longer. Now, we can then see this in the real world, and a great way to do this is actually by astrological gardening. If you're a gardener, try planting by the moon. Plant seeds when the moon is waxing, when it's got a little bit of light. That first crescent is going to be the best time to do it. And watch what happens through the cycle. You'll notice, for example, that you are able to harvest things a lot easier and a lot better when the moon is actually waning because everything's starting to dry out. So it actually ends up like I just had to do a whole bunch of ritual harvesting for my witchcraft. And I couldn't wait because I had to do things before a certain date. And it took forever for these plants to dry in my window. I'm like, gosh, this is like 3 weeks on. Can we finish this up. And it's because I had done it during this waxing phase where all this moisture had surged in these plants. And so it was going to take a hell of a lot longer for it to dry out, right? But when I do it during a waning phase, like I'm about to go do in a little bit here, they dry much faster, which is exactly what I want for this next project. And I need them to dry quickly. I don't want to wait 3 weeks for them to finish up their drying process. You can also see when things are, for example, if you wanted to make sure that some pests went away. If you do this during a waxing phase, it's going to be hard because the waxing phase gives them strength. They're growing. And so if you cut something, you'll notice that your plant will quickly grow right back. It has the most energy to grow. But if you want to get rid of some pests or you need to do something where you need to trim your plant, right? Best thing to do if you're trying to kill some sort of pestilence is actually to wait for it to wane. It tends to have this dying off effect that's really rapid and very complete. I've experimented with this a lot. I actually had a whole class on this called From Seed to Flower a while back. 6 whole weeks on this, not just the moon, but multiple other things. And I can't tell you how many of my students would come back just floored at the fact that, like, wow, okay, yes, I did try to do this trimming and the plant grew like a weed, which you can do this with your hair too. Your hair has the same thing. If you do it during a waxing phase, it'll grow really quickly. If you do it during a waning phase, like let's say that you wanted to like get a nice number 2 on the sides, right? Um, you don't want it to grow fast. So do it during a waning phase, right? But you can see this with pests. You can see this with trying to get rid of something with your plant. And it's a really, really fast way to look at how the moon is immediately affecting you. Now, in your own world, you can track things just by moon transits. You can keep a journal. This is like the easiest way. You don't even have to know anything about astrology. Download an app that gives you the different phases of the moon. You don't even have to look at the signs, just the phases. And you'll see very quickly when things start and when they end and how fast they sync up with these moon cycles. It may take a few cycles for something to really emerge, but you're going to see it. And it's actually one of the first practices I would advise to anyone who wants to get better at astrology is spend a year tracking the moon phases. If you're really a little more advanced, look at the signs and how it's contacting your chart. But you'll be floored at how often the moon has more to do when things are initiated and when they end versus anything else. Even if you're not ruled by the moon. I'm not ruled by the moon. I'm a Scorpio rising. So like the moon has nothing to do with it's actually like the antithesis of the moon is Scorpio rising. Wants nothing to do with Scorpio, and yet the moon has everything to do with how my life unfolds. um and the moon and the stars were the first ever calendar. It was not the planets. We didn't understand that planets were planets. We thought they were wandering stars that had like erratic movement. It used to be the moon and the fixed stars. The Egyptians had a very advanced calendar for this called the decans. Later gets changed by the Greeks into something that's, fixed and less about the stars. But originally, the decans were the moon moving through the different stations of the stars and how they would rise together or set together. Um, and this is reflected kind of all over the world. Before we knew anything about planets, everything was stars and moon. The first ever calendar written down was phases of the moon on a piece of bone. So we've been tracking the moon for a long time. Today, we are very solar fixed. And this becomes a problem because the sun has a 1-year cycle, but our bodies do not actually function on a 1-year cycle. I can't do this because of my own female health, but women, give this a try. Try to go to sleep in the dark leading up to the full moon. And then if you can open your curtains and let the moon in, great. But if not, put a nightlight on for the day of the full moon, 2-3 days, and then go back to the dark. It's very likely your cycle will actually start to sync up. Our bodies are meant to be in sync with the world around us, not just the sun, the moon. And we see this with animals. They will have very predictable cycles. They're not all over the place. It has to do with the new or the full moon almost always. And so when we look at that and we see how solar dominant, and we've got, electric lights in our house and stuff, we're completely out of sync. And that means that we're not on a cycle every month where we understand we have to rest, that things are coming to an end, that this is not the time to initiate. And I find that a lot of clients that I've had get frustrated, whether they're doing magic or they're doing mundane things, because they initiate something when the moon is in a waning cycle. And they're like, nothing came of it. And I'm like, I bet not. The moon wasn't there to help it grow. You need the moon to be in a place where it can grow, waxing. And just changing that, which most of us don't want to wait 2 weeks. Man, if you just wait those 2 weeks, life will be so much better. I'm
Mm-hmm.
like ranting over here, but I'm a big like live by the moon person because we have completely and totally gotten away from that. And you can see it in our bodily health. You can see it in the way that our mental health struggles. There's no rest. There's no waning for us.
Mm-hmm.
There's none of that. If we're just waiting for the end of the year where we get a couple of weeks, or even just for a lot of adults, a couple of days from Christmas to New Year's to rest, we're gonna die. And there's a difference between living a long time and being alive. We may live
Mm-hmm.
to 75, 80 and have the worst quality of life ever because we are not treating ourselves well. And the moon basically says you have a cycle, all of us, whether you've got a womb or not, you've got a cycle, and you need to respect it. Some days you're going to be way more energetic, way more productive, and other days you're not. And this idea that you're supposed to have like the perfect daily schedule is complete bunk to the moon. The moon's like, no, more like monthly. Get with the
Mm-hmm.
monthly schedule. And even then, what if I'm making contact with Saturn or Mars? You're probably not going to get much done, or there's going to be conflict there, or things are going to slow down. And that's not about you, that's about things outside of you. And it's a little egomaniacal to think it's about us all the time.
It's true. I agree with that. Yeah, and I think too that I mean, even just the concept that like not every moment is the right one to initiate something. Like, oh, if I want to initiate this, perhaps I must be patient and wait for a more auspicious time is a pretty rebellious concept, I think, when it comes to a world where the way that we conceive of being, quote, productive or, um, you know, living our best life or whatever that is. It's just even the concept that this may not be an opportune moment to like plunge ahead is really countercultural in a lot of ways. And voluntarily waning, I think, is a skill that I certainly have not even begun. I'm a student of voluntarily waning and voluntarily letting go. Like, why do I always have to grip so hard? It has to be ripped from my hands. Like, why couldn't I just let it go on my own and like really become a little more sovereign of those own cycles for myself? So I love all of that encouragement to do that.
Well, and a way to look at it, because a lot of people, they're like, well, I have a full time job. And I'm like, I
Mm-hmm.
get that. So what if we looked at it like the waning period is when we finish up loose ends? Because then those are coming to an end, right? So we're not trying to start new projects if we can help it. Instead, we're trying to finish up what's already on our plate. How much more would just get finished anyways because we're not trying to force ourselves to initiation. So that saying is like 90% of the rocket fuel is to just get off the ground,
Mm-hmm.
just break the atmosphere. Every time we start something new, we're using 90% of the energy just to get ourselves to go, right? If instead you were like, you know what, I think I'm going to take this allocation of energy here and I'm just going to finish things that are already outstanding and just take them off my list, right? If you're going to quiet quit on that end of the spectrum during the waning period, it's a great time to do that because everyone's feeling it anyways. You'll notice everyone in the office, there's a half of the month where they're just all pissy. Okay. Everyone's tired. Not very much is getting done. And you won't be in kind of like glaringly obvious to everybody else that you are not doing as much as you normally do. Instead, you'll just look like you're part of the cultural vibe. And then if you want to like be more productive, when it starts to wax again, you'll be like, okay. Another cool thing to do that maybe some people may want to do it, some people don't. I've been experimenting with this for the last 2 years and it's been mind blowing. Go and look up whatever your closest tidal tables are. So when the tide is high or low, some people, you're gonna be like, I'm in the middle of the United States. What does that have to do with me? Because it still affects the moisture content around you. Even if you're by a lake, it's happening. Okay, so whichever side of the United States you feel you're closer to, find a tidal table. Okay, and look at the times, translate them to wherever you're at. That things are high and low, and look at what happens to you during the day during the highs and the lows. It's pretty wild. I notice that when the tide is low, I feel like I need a nap. I can't help it. I start to immediately get tired. And when the tide is high, I'm like the Energizer Bunny. I want to get so much done. And this may even show you, like, oh, that's why. And here's the thing: the tides don't stay at the same time every day. It's something people don't know, but like the tides are not like on this. They're affected by the moon. So some days they're going to get high early in the morning, and some days they're not. And you may find your sleep correlates with that. Or if you've got chronic illness, your symptoms get worse or better at different times during the day. Um, and it's pretty wild to just track it. I've been tracking it for a while. I have a dedicated journal just for the tide times, and I write little bullet points, nothing that complicated. I don't have a fancy grimoire. I am not that person. I am way, way too much earth in my chart for that. It's just a smudge mark of like, oh, needed a nap at this time, or went and did this at this time, right? Just so I can track how is this affecting me? And am I really sunk up with it, or am I completely out of sync with it? And maybe that's why I feel so tired all the time. And it's funny, whether you voluntarily choose to do it or not, you'll usually find out that you are tired when the tide is at a certain point, and you are energized when the tide is at another point. And maybe we could just move with that rather than trying to fight it. Because this all has to do with like that, again, the water, the moisture content, the ocean. You have moisture in your body. I've also started noticing I get more dehydrated when the tide is low, which has been wild. It kind of
Mm.
made my brain break for a couple of weeks. I was like, how's that happening? And I was like, oh yeah, you are also like affected by the moon, dummy. Like, of
It's
course
funny.
it affects you, you
Yeah,
know?
of course. And it's funny, but that's so revelatory for our day and age. We think we're regulated by technology more so than time and space, where we are in that little formula, where we are in that little pin on the map, I guess. And so I love that a lot of the things that you're suggesting is a lot about just paying attention and getting to know, and how that is specific to where you are and to who you are, and building your own body of knowledge around that, I think is really important, regardless of what it looks like, whether it's a notebook or whether it's a mental note, or whether, whether someone's making spreadsheets or smudge marks, whatever someone's version is around that. Um, I'm wondering too, a lot of your practice includes or relates to fixed stars. And I know that we don't have like a whole episode to dedicate
No,
just to
no.
that, which is it's a whole thing. It's a big thing. It's really big. But I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to just the perspective of relating to fixed stars and what that's sort of done for your relationship to, how you're relating to the map of the heavens and the stars, and maybe how that differs from some of the ways that we conceive it.
So I think I've told this story a few times, but I'll briefly go back over it again. In 2016, I was in the Czech Republic. I had been studying a bit of traditional astrology, and I had stumbled into the idea of like, oh, my Venus is conjoined Vega, which is considered to be in Capricorn. If you, and this is what I didn't understand, projected it onto the ecliptic. Okay. Now, for those who are not super astro nerds, the ecliptic is the part of the sky that the sun travels on, and it's also where the planets roughly follow behind. It is not the whole sky, it's this little narrow band. Okay. And it's where the zodiac is. The zodiac is actually more conceptual than literal. The Greeks already knew about the precession of the equinoxes. They also knew there were 13 signs. Don't worry, NASA's not got one on
Oh my
us.
God.
We've known about the 13th constellation, but they chose 12, okay? And the reason
Yeah.
why is because it was never fully aligned with the stars. Not even the sidereal zodiac is fully aligned with the stars, because the constellations are all different sizes. So this is important because what I didn't know is that most of the sky is not on the ecliptic.
Mm-hmm.
So I went out to go stargazing, thinking I would find this star somewhere near Capricorn. Took out my little app, it's got a little zodiac on it. Could not find this star to save my life. It had not risen yet, and it rose on the opposite side of the sky as Capricorn. And I was like, wait a second. I thought that traditional astrology was based off of observation, which is why I got into it. I didn't want it to just be psychological. I wanted it to be connected to the earth, you know? It is, but it's not about the stars really. Hellenistic astrology, they then superimpose the stars. They take a star from one part of the sky and they project it back onto this little band that we call the ecliptic, where the zodiac is. So this kind of broke my brain for a minute. Um, And of course, I had all the questions people usually ask, like, is astrology even real then? Like,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I had to like go deep into like the philosophy of why they did this and everything. But it led me to learning about fixed stars from Bernadette Brady. Bernadette Brady is Dr. Bernadette, pardon me, is largely responsible for the reconstruction of an Egyptian method called parentalenta, which is colloquially called parents. Um, and what was wild about this method, first of all, I loved how mythological it was. You had to get into the myths of the stars in order to understand it. Um, Secondly, it's about when the stars actually rise and set and where they're physically located in the sky in a 3D relationship to the planets, which again was a whole added layer of like, I have no idea how to figure this out. Because again, we look at the ecliptic, we flatten it. We flatten everything under this little 2D chart. And that's not how parentalenta works at all. It's about where things are really located in the sky. Um, but what was crazy is how accurate these myths would map over in these relationships to the planets and actually modify the planets, which started to make a lot of sense to me. Because oftentimes I had a few friends who had gotten readings from extremely famous traditional astrologers who are known for like being super accurate and kind of breaking the ground for everybody. And they're like, yeah, it didn't really do it for me. Um, One in particular kind of sticks out because they had been told by a couple of people they really respected. These people said, I don't know how you're an author. Nothing in your chart says you should be or that you will be.
Mm.
But when I pulled up their fixed stars, they have all these storytelling stars, stars that are specifically known to like a lot of people who are artists or authors have these stars. And I started to think about how we originally did everything by the stars. In fact, the Egyptian method is really, it gives us a lot of cosmological background for what happens with the Greeks later. The
Mm-hmm.
Greeks kind of take a lot of it, deconstruct it, and put it into their own stuff. And what was wild is that parentalenta is not just an Egyptian thing. Every culture around the world has at some point created something like parentalenta to talk about the stars, and specifically the heliacal rising, which is when a star is first visible before the sun in the morning. So it's like about 45 minutes before sunrise. It's the first star that rises over the horizon before the sun. And the heliacal setting, similar thing, sun is rising, the star is setting on the other side. So when I started looking at this, like historically, and then also in practice, because it's one thing to be like, historically, they did this. Let me tell you, if you get through the historical, like, aphorisms of the Babylonians, some of the things they wrote down were not even physically possible. Like, it never happened because it couldn't happen, right? So just because it's historical doesn't mean that it's correct. I have a lot of Saturn in my chart. I'm not that Saturnian. But this method did work. It worked in practice as well as in theory. And it gave a different dimension to the chart. It added to the chart. And it also opened up more possibilities to the chart so you could understand, like, oh, that's why this is this way. I couldn't otherwise understand that previously. Um, and it was really wild to see it in my own life. The big thing about getting into relationship with the stars, I started that because, first of all, I'm an animist. So I was really big on talking about relationships with the planets. It's a big part of how I do remediation for people. Um, but the big one was, it was a personal project. I had not just an algal conjunction, but I had like a billion algal pirons. Now, if you know nothing about algal, this is the star of Medusa, her cut off head that Perseus is carrying around in the sky. Um, and it's considered to be, according to the Greek astrologers, the most evil star in the sky. So I was immediately like, oh shit. This is not great. And I needed to like really dive deep into it because like none of the aphorisms for the star were good.
Mm-hmm.
Even Brady's interpretations were not great. Um, and I started looking at remediation for it as well. And I was like, what if the problem isn't that I need to like lock you up in a box or ignore you or silence you, but that I actually need to give you purposeful voice in my life? Because Medusa wasn't just like she it's crazy. She's really freaking powerful. No other
Mhm.
monster in the pantheon of the Greek myths is as powerful as Medusa for such a small little story she has.
Mhm.
She not only can freeze people where they are, which has a lot to do with being able to see the truth, right? But the blood from the right side of her heals anything. The blood from the left side of her kills anything. Her head can be used on a shield. She gives birth to Pegasus, which is actually an allegory for how Perseus began to control the winds with his sail. Um, and it just goes on and on. She gives birth to all the snakes in Libya, they say, because the blood from her neck drips down and gives birth to all of them. She's just really powerful, and you don't see that with these other monsters, which was really remarkable to me. And the deeper I got into it, the more I was like, oh, you're a primordial creatrix. Now, without getting into like modernizing this too much, having the head cut off is to say that you are in ecstasis or ecstasy. So she's almost shamanistic in a sense. And the idea that she had to have her head cut off has to do with the giving of knowledge in an ecstatic way. Just like Dionysus, in his rites, you were torn apart piece by piece, right? We see that with Orpheus. And that is to say that you are being ritually torn apart to then be rebuilt again. In a witch sense, this is a witch body, right?
Mhm.
So it's not bad. It's hard. I'm not going to sit here and romanticize it. I think most Algol natives, we go through a tough part in life if we don't learn that we need to have some sort of creative outlet for all this. And actually, the person who really drove this home for me was Diana Rosenberg's book, Secrets of the Ancient Skies, which
Mhm.
I've got this everywhere. Like, if I could only have one set of books, it would be hers because it gives way more case studies and context. And she was the first one to be like, hey, do you see how many artists and writers and performers have algal in their charts? And when I read that, I was like, oh, relief. I'm not going to have my head cut off at some point. Like, which would be great, honestly. Sometimes these aphorisms are really literal. But I also had to like make peace with like you can't be scared of your chart. Being
Mhm.
scared of your chart is not going to give you a great life, you know? And also, it's keeping you from stepping into your full power and agency to enact your free will within this chaos soup. So, if
Mhm.
you're avoiding anything Algolian, I think it's funny the people who try to do that, who are like, oh, this is so scary, they end up having the worst time. They have the weirdest things happen to them because you can't ignore this bigger force in your life. Um, and actually, that's the last workshop I'm releasing this year. Is I've redone this whole thing, but I mean, she's about terraforming. And if you ever think about how a glacier terraforms a valley, like it's vital. And also if you were around while it happened, you'd be terrified because it is a giant hunk of ice tearing through a landscape, making mountains and laying down these primordial elements that eventually become plants. Um, I also use volcanoes. Volcanoes are very essential. They are some of the most fertile soil in the world. And actually, extant volcanoes in the ocean called atolls are the basically the cradle of evolution. Um, but also, like you don't want to be around volcanoes when they happen to go off. And they're not sitting there waiting for when it's convenient for you.
Mhm.
They don't care. So if I look at her like she's a volcano, there's a different kind of respect. It's not like she's evil, which is I think is a very kind of like modern human conception of this. It's more like she's primordial.
Mhm.
And if I come to her with respect and I try to understand her and give her a voice, it ends up being a much better outcome for me than trying to get rid of her because I can't. She's in my chart. Whether I like it or not, she's there. So I might as well become friends with her. And in doing that, my life improved almost instantly. The results were very telling in and of themselves. Because up to that point, I didn't even know I was fighting her, and I was fighting her all the time.
Mhm.
But it also meant I got to embrace the other gifts in my chart beyond her. She just happened to be the loudest screaming baby for me.
Mhm.
And I was like, we got to deal with this. Like, we don't want to keep going down that road. That's not fun.
Yes. Yeah, it's a lot about, I feel like something there too about just embracing like ferocity and the primordial quality that, especially if we've been programmed to be nice or pleasant or agreeable at all times, is a really powerful dismemberment and therefore creative practice. Um,
You find with algal natives, they're often the whistleblowers who then get scapegoated.
mhm.
So they're the ones that are like, hey, the emperor is not wearing any clothes. And then everyone starts stoning them because they're like, shut up, he is wearing clothes. Okay, you just keep buying into that delusion, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense. I think that I would love to share with listeners where they can find out more about working with you, learning from you, things that you have coming up, and where you like people to do that. Before we jump into that, is there anything that you feel like you'd love to share that I didn't make space for that you'd love to leave our listeners with?
Oh gosh, we really like sat down and we gave the most like broad description of this and then we're like, we'll see how it goes. I feel like we've packed a lot in. I
Mm-hmm.
can't think of anything right now. Other than learning how to sail through the moon cycles every month and not being scared of the parts of yourself that maybe aren't palatable to the less
Mm-hmm.
primal world.
Mm. I love that as a parting note of wisdom. Where can people work with you? Where do you like people to find you on the internet and follow you? Do you have anything coming up this fall or early winter that you want to have on people's radars? And just share all the ways that we can be in touch with your work.
Definitely my website, amayarourke.com. And then same thing with Instagram. Those are the two places you're going to hear from me. I try my best not to be everywhere. I used to be a big Twitter user. That place became unbearable. So I haven't been on there in I think almost a year. But those are the two places. And the only big thing I have coming this fall, like in the coming weeks, is definitely like I'm re-releasing that algal workshop, which everyone's waited, I think, 2 years for. But she basically pulled me by the hair and was like, hey, we got work to do here. And there's a lot of things that need to be added or changed. So
Mm,
that's been in process for a while. And I'm very excited about it because it's much truer to my actual practice. I got the gag lifted. Often, when you work with spirits, there are taboos on sharing things. And
mm,
this was one where she's like, actually, I want you to like give almost the full Monty, tell them
mhm.
everything. I was like, okay. So I had to sit down and systematically like write it out and kind of get it all together in a form that other people could recognize because my own practices are not necessarily always the most formulaic.
Mhm. Yeah,
But that's the most
translatable.
exciting thing
I love that.
that's going to be happening. Otherwise, I'm hoping to take this winter very easy. That's the goal, is
Hmm.
to take it easy. But if I do have anything that opens up or anything like that, it'll be on my website. I do have a whole series of upcoming blogs on like, if you've wondered what is the difference between a witch and a sorcerer and a mystic and all that, I have a whole series of blogs getting ready to drop. They're going to be completely free for people to read. And just because it's a question I get so often that I finally was like, okay, we've got to start
Hmm.
parsing this out and making it easier because unless you're like me and you're crazy and you're buying like a whole bunch of anthropological books, it's really hard to know because the modern ideas of these things are very different from where they originated from.
Hmm.
And I tend to be the one that favors having a bit of both. I think that we need to look to the past and respect it and make it modern today. So if you're curious, you want to learn more, that's all going to be on the website.
Awesome. Well, we'll make sure all of that is in the show notes below. If you're listening to this, you'll be able to easily click and find all the things that Amaya is talking about. And thank you so much for coming onto the podcast with me. I really loved nerding out on all of this with you, and for generously sharing all the things that you love and all the things that you know. So thank you.
Thank you for having me. This is a treat, and I super appreciate you, and I hope everyone enjoys this.